There's the Catholic priest standing next to my mother and father, holding her hand. I knew something was wrong as soon as I saw that. And then in the doorway, there are the two Marine officers in their uniforms. And I was in shock. I thought, oh no, how dare you come to my house?
Welcome to Bereaved But Still Me, a space where we honor grief, share stories, and remind one another that even after loss, we are still here. I'm your host, Michael Liben, father of three children, Liel, Sapir, and Idan. After losing my daughter Liel at the age of 15, I began this project of listening, learning, and holding space for others navigating loss. I'm grateful you're here with us today. Our guest brings us a story that spans decades, one that began with unimaginable loss and evolved into a life of meaning, healing, and service to others. At just 19 years old, Ellen M. Laura became a widow when her first husband was killed in the Vietnam War in 1968. What followed was not just grief, but a long and complex path through trauma, spiritual questioning, and ultimately transformation. Today, Ellen is a teacher, author, and wellness coach who helps others navigate loss and rediscover hope. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us here on Bereaved But Still Me.
Thank you for inviting me, Michael. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Can you take us back to that time in your life? What do you remember about who you were at 19 and how everything changed when your husband was killed?
Well, at 19, there I was, still living at home in my parents' house while Brian was off to Vietnam. And I'm baking cookies and polishing my fingernails and writing letters to my sweetheart and imagining the future. We lived in this very small town, Frankfort, New York, with 2,000 people who were all the same. Italian Catholic. I could not wait for my life to start. Brian had promised we could move to California or maybe even Hawaii. So I was living with this young, hopeful dream of my future. And then suddenly I went from being this young woman with a dream life ahead of me to becoming a widow. I mean, I wasn't even really an adult, and that loss, it was not only shattering, but it was so fast. There was no graceful crossing. No, I mean, I suppose I should have had some idea that it could happen, but I didn't. I was in total denial. His mother, on the other hand, was anxious and worried, but whenever I saw her, I would say, "Oh, Colette, he's coming home to us. He'll be fine." So I was in such a state of denial that the shock was even harder. And of course, it was during the Vietnam War protests. So I'm hearing all of that in the background. And then when the shock came, it was just devastating.
How long had you been married when you lost him?
We were only married 6 weeks. He had been
Oh,
my sweetheart for 2 years before that. But before he was shipped off, he asked me to marry him.
uh-huh.
And I, of course, said yes. I remember very clearly my father said, absolutely not. No one in this house is getting married on that short notice. Of course, we all know what he was thinking, worried
Hmm.
about that, the appearance that maybe I was pregnant. So I went to my grandmother and I said, Gram, you're the only one who can convince him that he needs to show up at the wedding. So
Oh,
it was
wow.
only 6 weeks. We got married in a Catholic church on November 6th. We had a short honeymoon in Niagara Falls, and then he was gone.
How long had it been shipped off? Just a few weeks.
Just a
It
few
was all
weeks.
all in
Yes,
one shot.
all at once, very, very early, you know, uh, one of, I guess, barely there and gone.
I can hardly imagine the extent of the change from one to the other, from being joyful and happy and very young to suddenly being very grown up and very empty. I can't really imagine what that must be like. Losing a spouse at any age is devastating, but at 19, when life is just beginning, it must have felt especially disorienting. What were those early days and months looking like for you?
Oh, I was a wreck. So the Marine officers show up at the house. The priest actually was there. So here I am in my bedroom asleep, and I hear people in the living room. And I walk out and I say, Ma, what's going on? And there's the Catholic priest standing next to my mother and father, holding her hand. I knew something was wrong as soon as I saw that. And then in the doorway, there are the two Marine officers in their uniforms. And I was in shock. I thought, oh no, how dare you come to my house? I had actually, Michael, had a dream that night that I was in the back seat of a car and I heard these Marine officers and I was totally disoriented. Is this still part of the dream? Is this really happening? And then I screamed at them. I shouted, "Get out of my house, you horrible murdering people. You can't be here." Of course, my parents were horrified. They didn't know what to do. The Marine officers just looked around to see if any adult was in control. And then they pulled out the telegram, the one that many of us have seen in movies. We
Mm-hmm.
regret to inform. We regret to inform that your husband, Brian H. Burdick, was killed in Vietnam during duty, something, something, something. His mother has been notified. So I was numb. I was crazy. I was angry. I was a wreck, an absolute wreck.
You mentioned it that it's like the movies, but it's the worst kind of moment to be in a movie. You know what I'm saying? It's we all have these wonderful ideas, sometimes fantasy movies and things that we want for ourselves, and then this kind of thing just cuts in, and it's hard for me to accept that this really happened, only because it's just so much like a film and a bad one. I have trouble with that. Does that stay with you? I mean, do you wake up with that sometimes in the middle of the night? Is that still fresh?
No, I don't. I have the telegram. One of the
Hmm.
things that, for some strange reason, I've moved and lived in many different places, Michael. I have
Hmm.
a bag that has the telegram and I have all of Brian's letters. Some of them even have
Hmm.
mold on them. But no, I don't have that feeling anymore. But I think one of the things we discussed when we were preparing for this, there are certain things that trigger it. Okay, so for me, a
Hmm.
big trigger is war. So here we
Hmm.
are in the midst of the war in the Middle East. I hear
Hmm.
that and it all comes back like, you're doing what? You're sending more boys to be killed so you can
Hmm.
line your pockets. It brings back all of the anger I had toward the government, toward war. So that trigger happens occasionally. But of course, I mean, that's years and years ago. There are long times when I don't think about it at all.
People may or may not know I live in that war zone that you were just describing. We haven't had any air raids for several weeks now, but every now and then a motorcycle will go by with a rising sound, and I think, oh no, and I start heading for the shelter, and it's not that. There's a trigger that you can feel it in your entire body. You can feel the change. You can feel that moment. And now I'm living that moment, but for you, after all these years, it still hits just the same, doesn't it?
It does because I thought about that when I realized where you were. I thought I wanted to cry. I thought, oh my God, there's Michael and he's in the middle of it. So, yeah, I don't want to get all emotional about it, but I felt sad that you were there.
I appreciate that. So far, we're fine. It's not quite being in the war the same way. Many people talk about the shock that follows a sudden loss, especially when connected with wars we've been talking about. Did you feel supported during that time, or did you find yourself navigating much of your grief all by yourself?
Well, it was a mix because early on, my parents didn't know what to do with me. They were embarrassed. I
Hmm.
was acting like a crazy person, saying, I'm not going to that funeral. I will not go. If there are Marine soldiers there with guns and rifles, I'm not going. So they were horrified and embarrassed. Um, a lot of my Catholic relatives would say things that I overheard. I could remember one of my uncles saying, well, she's used goods now. Nobody will want her. So, of course,
No.
yes,
You heard
yes,
that?
yes, I heard it. I heard it. And I was like,
Oh
you know,
my.
and then another one of my mother's sisters, one of my aunts, she had lost a boy. Her son had died when he was maybe 7 or 8. And we all knew that she had never recovered from it. But she would say things like, well, it's not like losing a child. You can find another husband. You're young.
Oh, oh.
Yeah, so we've talked about this. We are still, even back then, but still today, we are more of an illiterate grief world. We don't know how to deal with grief. People still say things like, it was meant for the best, or they're in a better place now. They say things because we haven't really been trained on what to do about that. So at first, of course, there was no one. And then over the months, I decided I was going to go to school to be an x-ray technician in Albany. So that was 7 or 8 months after Brian died. And when I got there, for some reason, I start meeting all of these people who are on a search for meaning. They're going to metaphysical classes. They're reading books, the Masters of the Far East. They're reading books by Gurdjieff. There was one woman in particular. She was a roommate for me. We were both x-ray technician trainees, and she lived in the hall from me, and she was deeply searching for something spiritual. And then there was a man I met. He was a second-year medical student, and he was very wise to me at that point, and he'd studied all kinds of metaphysical things. So when those people showed up in my life, Michael, that was the shift. I thought, these are people like me who are searching for why we're here. Why do these things happen to us? Why does life end with death? Does it really end there, or what's after? So at home, they didn't know what to do with me, but then I met friends. And then the good thing was, when I returned home to visit with my parents, I had more compassion because I understood that they didn't know what to do with me.
You are listening to Bereaved But Still Me. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our program, please send an email to Michael Liben at michael@bereavedbutstillme.com. That's Michael at bereavedbutstillme.com. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
Ellen, you've described your life as one who moved through despair and spiritual upheaval. Can you share what that looked like for you? Were there moments when your beliefs or your sense of meaning were shaken or even broken? And how did that all come together? And I'm guessing that this had a lot to do with the people you met later at school.
Yeah, some of it did. But before I met them, the biggest upheaval, and I don't know if this is appropriate because it might be a trigger for some people, but within 6 weeks after Brian died, I took a big overdose of sleeping pills. I didn't want to live. I didn't have any spiritual comfort at that point. I didn't really have any beliefs to abandon because I wasn't really religious. I hadn't really turned my life over to anything as like a higher power or God. So there I am, and I take this huge overdose of sleeping pills, and I had this vision. It was like I heard this voice say, if you do this, nothing will be better. Your life will be just the same, but without a body. And I thought, what? Who's speaking to me? But that caused me to call 911. The ambulance came. I had my stomach pumped, and I woke up in the ICU, and the doctor said, the only reason you did not die, you took an overdose large enough to kill an elephant. And when we pumped your stomach, the whole thing came up in one big ball. So I thought, well, I guess I'm supposed to still be here. So that was the traumatic shock, devastating. And then there were months after that where, of course, I had to live with that. My parents, again, were horrified. They show up and find me in the hospital, and they're embarrassed and wondering, what did you do? First, you have outbursts at the funeral, you have outbursts at our house, then you do something like this. So there was all the shock of how I had behaved, and that wasn't easy for anybody who knew me. No one in my family, they were all horrified. So that's when I decided I had better become a sane person. It was like, there I am sitting there in the hospital, Michael, and I thought, I don't think these doctors can really take care of me. I think what I'm searching for is something so much deeper that I need to go on a different path and I need to become a sane person immediately. I need to shape up. I need to figure out what I'm doing with my life and get on with it because I don't want to be taken care of by people who aren't asking those deeper questions. Maybe that doctor asked those, but maybe he wasn't allowed to discuss it with me as a patient. So
That's
that
really
was,
impressive, by the way. That's really impressive that you could do that for yourself. I don't know many people who can take charge, especially when they're that low in their situation. Did you also feel that maybe your parents were upset so much because their grief was not your grief and you were intruding on them or something? It sounds to me like they were saying, you're getting in the way of ours. Did you feel that?
at the time, I did not because maybe I was too young or too selfish to understand anybody else's grief other than
Mm-hmm.
my own and Brian's mother. I understood her grief because he was her son. That was very clear to me. When Brian's brother came to the funeral, I understood his grief. But for my own parents, it wasn't clear to me. All that was clear was they didn't know what to do with me, this
Mm-hmm.
person who's still living at home with them, living in their house, and behaving in a way that they didn't know what to do with. So as I said, it was months later after being in Albany, after making new friends, after really beginning my own spiritual quest, and some of that involved compassion, that I could turn to them and see more of who they were, and that
Mm-hmm.
my identity wasn't the only thing going on in their lives. Here I was supposed to be someone who was married and going to have a future, and then I'm a widow and
Mm-hmm.
misbehaving in their house. I'm behaving in a way that was embarrassing.
Well, how did that affect or shape your future identity? You've just begun to touch on that, and I want to hear more there.
Well, I don't know why, Michael, but maybe it was pride, maybe it was being born a Leo, I don't know, but I did not want to be identified as a victim. I didn't like the whole idea of being a widow. I was embarrassed about it. I thought I'm not going to do this. I could even remember on the way to the funeral thinking to myself, well, what if I could show up there and be like Jackie Kennedy and be refined and calm and beautiful and instead of being seen as a victim. So from the beginning, I didn't like the identity of being a widow. I rejected it for many years. I rarely
Mm-hmm.
spoke about it. At times, I brought it up, but for a long time, I couldn't weave that grief into who I was.
That's an interesting point. How important is that? Because I believe that the grief stays with us in one form or another, but we find a way to carry it forward. It sounds to me like you're trying to deny that grief, and yet somehow, obviously, it's still a part of you. How did you navigate that weaving? Because that I find very hard.
Took me a while, a year, two or three, where I could begin to weave the grief into who I was.
Hmm.
Because underneath all of that anger and rage, the grief was there waiting for me to embrace it. So, as I say, I had to move through the deep anger and rage and uncover it. And then once I was able to uncover it, of course, it became part of my identity. And from
Hmm.
then on, I met so many people who were also grieving. They would show up in my life in different ways, and I was able to meet them because I had no longer rejected that part of myself.
What did you do to get through some of the hardest periods of all of that? Was there something that you could do? Was there a method, something to think about?
Well, as I said, it was a spiritual quest. So I went to many different spiritual teachers. I went to seminars, but that was the path: yoga, meditation, turning to that way of thinking. And I think also considering reincarnation. I thought, well, maybe this lifetime is not the lifetime for me to have Brian in my life. Maybe he'll be there for me in the future. So for me, it was accepting the view that life continued beyond this one. So I know not everyone embraces that belief that there are other lives and we live beyond, but that was it for me. It was, this is not the only life. And I think the other part of the spiritual quest was your life situation is not your life. Your life is something sacred and holy that was given to you. And what happens in your life situation will change. And so it reminds me of the name of your podcast.
Hmm.
You know, you're still you. There's still a part of you
Yeah.
that was given to you, your soul, something eternal, and that
Yeah.
continues. So if someone has that spiritual belief, whether they have it now or whether they're open to it, that's what it was for me. What guided me was turning my life over to something that I considered sacred and holy.
If you've enjoyed listening to this program, please visit our website, heartsunitetheglobe.org, and make a contribution. This program is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a nonprofit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to educate, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, hospitals that treat CHD survivors, summer camps for CHD families, and much, much more. Over time, you moved not just toward healing, but helping others. What were some of the turning points that helped you move towards a deeper sense of meaning?
It was a spiritual quest. I'm here to serve. That was the realization that I came to. If I'm here to serve, then of course. So for years, throughout my 20s, I taught meditation. I traveled all through the United States, Michael, into Europe. I spoke to groups between 50, 500, even a few thousand, teaching about meditation and how to turn your life over to what is sacred. So it was the beginning and it never left. It's just been part of who I became, someone who was here to share what brought me comfort, and it was my spiritual path.
You recently revised your memoir and are now sharing your story more openly. What inspired you to revisit your story and to offer it to others at this stage of your life?
Well, I'll give you a little backstory on that. For many years, I was struggling with how to tell the story of my life with Brian. I was going to write a screenplay. I was going to write a novel. I was going to do many different things to share that. And then it was in 2023, I thought, no, I'm just going to write a very short memoir. So I did, and I published it, and it was called Love in the Shadow of Saigon. So it was out there and, it gave more of an insight into what I went through. Well, then, as we talked about earlier, the trigger was the war in the Middle East. And I thought, oh no, not again. You're here in my life, invading my life again. And I thought about it. I thought about all the young boys being sent there and the mothers and whether some of them are married. So that was what brought me to sit down in April. It was just in April that I thought, I'm going to revise this, add a little bit more to it, and bring it back out into the world, and maybe even offer it for anyone who wanted me as a guest on their podcast. So that was what brought it forward. And then because I was thinking about that, I thought, well, I could also offer a podcast about it. And so I just began. It only has one episode so far. And it's
Best of luck to you for that.
Yeah.
Best of luck.
Yeah. So I started that, but that was the trigger. It was the war that made me decide to bring it back out and to speak with people like you and your audience.
I'm curious because this recent war is not the first war since Vietnam. You were not triggered by earlier wars. Many of them were right in this area, but I'm thinking in Afghanistan and in Iraq, more people were sent than are being sent right now. More people died than are dying right now, and I mean American soldiers. That wasn't enough of a trigger. I'm curious what makes this one different.
Well, I did think about those, and I would have long conversations with friends about what was different between Vietnam and some of those other wars, and how the media and the government didn't want to see protests in the street to downplay it. But I think what was different about this is the propaganda. It hit me very hard. Reading so many controversial, who's for it, who's against it. I don't remember that in the previous Middle East wars. I don't remember there being as much controversy about we're for it and we have to do this and we're against it and you're a bad person if you're against it. So I think it was what hit me was not only the war, but the propaganda machine was louder than it had been in a while. The propaganda machine saying, this is important, we need to do this war. And I thought, yeah, you might think that, but I don't agree. And I have to
Mm,
add my voice to this. I don't
yeah.
agree. I didn't agree then. I didn't agree with any of your wars, and I don't agree now. So I don't know if that answers it, but
Well, yeah, I think part of the difference is that the previous Middle East wars for the U.S. anyway were sold to the American public differently. They took time to get popular before they started. This
yes,
just sort of erupted out of nowhere, and people were already very divided on what they liked and who they liked,
yes.
and this I think just exacerbated the whole thing. I'm curious though how that's different in terms of bringing your story forward. Any war is a terrible thing, and war is war. But there's something special about this one that made you come out in a way that the others, it seems to me that they didn't do. First of all, tell me if I'm wrong, and second of all, if I've hit something here, let's hear more about that.
Okay. Well, as I said, for many years, probably for the last 15 or 20 years, I'd been playing with the idea of writing a screenplay or a novel. So there were
Hmm.
times during those other wars that I did think about it, but when I sat down to turn it out, I couldn't do it. It was just, I just couldn't get it out. So it wasn't until 2023 that I actually put the memoir out. So that's only a few years back. So it wasn't that long ago. So it didn't seem to me that I wasn't thinking about those other wars, but maybe it was too raw. I'm not sure, Michael. It might have still been. I hired someone to guide me through writing a screenplay, and we would go through different things. And I have a whole novel that I've written. It's a fictional story. It's 60,000 words, and it's fictional. It's about a man who's killed in Vietnam, and he then is on this bridge where he meets angels, and they help guide him to the next realm, and he has to oversee the woman he left behind. I never finished it and I haven't published it yet.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that answers it, but it's always been a theme. But this memoir is more recent. And as you say, because there was more controversy about this, it's what brought it out.
That's interesting. I also think that for a lot of us, grief is the kind of thing that is near to us. We don't always feel it, but it's always there. And you took almost 50 years or more to pass through that to the point where you could speak about it openly. And I think that's very valid. I sometimes still have trouble talking about my daughter. It's only been 14 years, 13 and a half. And I can understand that sometimes it still doesn't want to come out. Did you feel that maybe you wanted to bring it out, but it just wouldn't?
Yes, yes. And when we first spoke and I asked you about your grief, you didn't mention the daughter first. You mentioned your parents. And
Yeah.
when you mentioned the daughter, I knew immediately, Michael, that's still raw. That's
Yeah.
still a little raw. So those of us who've been through it, we know what that feels like, what's still raw, and who we are okay to speak with.
Hmm.
So I'm
And
hoping
who
that
we're
I'm a
okay to
safe
speak
person.
about, I think, is also something. My mother only passed about 2 years ago,
Okay.
but it was completely different. I mean, losing a
Hmm.
parent is as hard as that
Yes.
is I think not the same as losing a child. And this is not to compare grief. This is not to say whose loss is better, but every loss is different and affects you differently.
Yes, and as I said, I sensed as soon as you mentioned the daughter, for those of us who've been through something, we know where the raw piece is, and
Yeah,
that's why
yeah,
we find each other.
yeah. We do. Eleonora, thank you so much for joining us on Bereaved But Still Me.
I'm so honored that you invited me, and I'm so honored to have met you and your team. You're doing wonderful work in this world, and I thank you from my heart.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's not for me to say what we're doing, but I do appreciate when people understand. Thank you for sharing your story with such honesty and depth. Your life is a powerful reminder that while grief may change us, it can also lead us towards deeper understanding, connection, and even purpose. And I am truly impressed by the purpose that you found and the desire to help others. For our listeners, we'll include links in the show notes to Ellen's memoir, Love in the Shadow of Saigon, as well as her website on Substack. And as always, if this episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who may need to hear it. Please join us again at the beginning of the month for a new episode. But until then, please take care of yourselves and each other. And remember, moving forward is not moving away.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you have felt supported in your grief journey. Bereaved But Still Me is a monthly podcast, and a new episode is released on the first Thursday of each month. You can hear our podcast anywhere you normally listen to podcasts at any time. Join us again next month for a brand new episode of Bereaved But Still Me.